We're living in a time in the church where social justice is at the forefront of everyone's mind. And I think this is largely the result of the emphasis of Pope Francis, who has made talking about the needs of the poor a priority. But the thing that is true about a crisis is that it will test the sincerity of certain beliefs and how committed people are to them, especially if those beliefs start to cost them something. And I would say that recent events, the recent crisis that we've been experiencing for the past couple of years or so, it did just that. And it makes me wonder, for the people who talk about social justice the most, first of all, do they even really truly understand what it is the church teaches about social justice and how it would get applied in certain scenarios? And even if they do, are they sincere when they rehearse these concepts in conversations that will portray them as the most committed to the needs of the poor? Quick thank you from this week's sponsor, the Saint Maker. We all want to become saints. The truth is, many of us spend our lives running from distraction to distraction, and even for dedicated Catholics, our quest for sainthood often takes a backseat. The Saint Maker is the first high-performance planner for the spiritual life made by faithful Catholics for faithful Catholics. Combining the practices of Catholic tradition throughout time with the science of personal productivity, the Saint Maker will help you grow in virtue and structure your spiritual life while getting organized and achieving ambitious goals. And that can actually help you become a saint. Saint Maker is a beautiful, easy to carry, and well-crafted companion to your Missal, Bible, and Rosary. It's published 4 times a year, each season including daily planning pages, feast days, and devotions for both forms of the liturgical calendar, goal-setting pages, confessional journals, and a lot more. There are lots of great and influential Catholics using the Saint Maker, like Scott Williams, CEO of Sock Religious, best-selling author Sam Guzman, YouTubers like Dina Barco and Amber Schneider, and priests like Father Dean Marshall and Father Corey Sticka. So give it a try, and if you decide that it's not for you, you can send it back for a full refund within 90 days. Visit thesaintmaker.com to shop the planners. Quantities are limited, so head over to thesaintmaker.com to order yours and to start your Saint Maker journey today. If you ever spend any time trying to learn about Catholic social teaching, you will inevitably collide with 2 concepts, solidarity and subsidiarity. And many respectable commentators and instructors on the subject will point out that if you ever want to evaluate and compare some system or fabric of society for its compatibility with Catholic social teaching, you should look to see if they get these 2 things right. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail what those concepts mean, although I am going to explain them a little bit for you here. But I would encourage you, if you are unfamiliar with them, to spend time learning about them, especially if social justice is something that's important to you. And a great place to start is in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, starting with paragraph 1878, going all the way to 1917. So again, for the sake of this video, I will summarize them as concisely as I can, starting with solidarity. So solidarity means treating your fellow man or humans, your fellow humans, if you prefer the gender neutral language, as neighbors rather than rivals. It means loving your neighbor as yourself and being invested in their interests as well as your own. On the political stage, this means preferring policies that produce a common good rather than only one for individuals or certain groups. Note, however, this doesn't mean blindly voting for a politician who pays a lot of lip service to concern for the poor. It's one thing to claim that, it's another thing to actually support policies that produce those effects. I think you'll see what I mean by the end of this video. And on that note, the last thing I'll say about solidarity is that our interests for our neighbor need to account most significantly for the most vulnerable. We could call this a preferential option for the poor. And it is summarized in Christ's teaching when he says, "That which you do for the least, you do for me." And I think it's fair to say that most Christians have some appreciation for this concept, whether they get the nuances of it or how it necessarily gets applied or not. But subsidiarity is something that there's a lot less familiarity with. St. John Paul II wrote an encyclical called Centissimus Annus, which is so named, Centissimus meaning centenary, because it was published on the 100th anniversary of Pope Leo XIII's legendary social encyclical Rerum Novarum, thus placing John Paul II's thought within the stream of the thought of Leo's. And here's what John Paul II had to say. Summarizing and defining subsidiarity, he said, "A community of a higher order should not interfere in the internal life of a community of a lower order, depriving the latter of its functions." What this means is that the governance of a community should take place at the most intimate and local level possible, and that larger, more remote, and more powerful structures should restrain themselves from interfering with those smaller community structures. So, for example, the most intimate level of community would be the family, and it should govern itself as independently as possible from larger or higher community structures. The family shouldn't define its domestic life or base its relationships based on mandates from higher authorities like the city or the state. Likewise, the city should not be interfered with by the state, the province, or the nation, or these higher forms, as much as possible, again. And it continues to scale up accordingly. Another way of saying this is that large and powerful political structures should be restrained from telling intimate and local structures how to live and function as a community. And the Catechism goes further. It goes on to say that the principle of subsidiarity is opposed to all forms of collectivism, and it sets limits on state intervention. In other words, collectivist socialism, that is not compatible with Catholic social teaching or the principles of solidarity or subsidiarity. Now, it's important to remember that solidarity and subsidiarity aren't exclusive to each other. One of the things that often happens when political principles get applied in the real world is that they end up falling prey to these false dichotomies that exist everywhere within the political spectrum. So if you're someone who gravitates to one end of the political spectrum, you might be someone who says, "Oh, I love subsidiarity," and you talk about it all the time, and then you neglect solidarity as if that doesn't apply. And then the same is true for the opposite end of the spectrum. And that's because people are getting the sense of a false dichotomy that exists between them. The truth of Catholic social teaching is that these two things are meant to work together in harmony to produce a common good. So, for example, subsidiarity, it doesn't mean that we're supposed to be living in some sort of extreme individualism. Solidarity reminds us that we are accountable to our neighbors and to each other, and we need to help each other. But that this help doesn't come primarily from large government structures. It occurs through intimate and local relationships first and foremost. So again, why am I talking about these concepts in the context of this video? Well, I would say, God willing, we are emerging from a global crisis in which two key strategies became dominant and widespread, and which, I would argue, clearly breach the principles of solidarity and subsidiarity. And we as a church seemed far too enthusiastic to endorse these policies in spite of our own teachings to the contrary. So let me provide you some examples of what I'm talking about. Let's start with lockdowns and mandates. So if you're someone with wealth and assets, it's really only an inconvenience to be prevented from going about your normal day-to-day activities for weeks, months, or even years at a time. But if you're someone whose only possession of value is your labor, which you then have to persistently sell in order to provide for your material needs. In other words, you're among the most vulnerable working class or the poor. Remember, those whose solidarity tells us that we need to show preference for when drafting our governing policies. If that's you, then you're someone for whom being locked down or heavily restricted means being unable to provide for yourself. But some will say the government accounted for this and provided financial support for such people. To which I would respond with a question, which is which government did that? Which government structure? Because here in Canada, it was the absolute highest. It was the federal government. And I'm pretty sure that in most other similar countries, they were operating the same way. Notice that this starts to run the risk of violating subsidiarity. But we don't really need to chase that rabbit just yet. I think the bigger concern here with big government just sending out checks to whoever it wants to is that you have to ask, where does that money come from? Because if you're just taking it from other working citizens and giving it to other working citizens, then you aren't really fixing the solution. You're just circulating it around and around. And that doesn't really solve anything. To show how absurd this policy is, here's a clip of Canadian finance critic Pierre Poilievre asking this exact same question to a parliamentary finance committee reviewing a proposal to inject an extra $7 billion at one point of support and aid that would be sent out to compensate to vulnerable people, as well as companies, as well as to the media, to compensate for the government's lockdown policies. He was asking this question to members of Justin Trudeau's government, as well as Finance Canada administrators.
How is the government paying the $7 billion bill associated with this proposal?
That question is directed to who, Mr. Poilievre?
Anyone who wants to answer it. If they have anyone over there that is concerned about where the money comes from, that person could speak up.
Maybe you could choose one of the witnesses.
I don't know who on their side is responsible for this, but clearly they're getting the money from somewhere, so they must know where.
This goes on like this for some time. He keeps asking the question, and people just stare at him blankly without a response.
Right, C2 has a $7 billion bill. That's the price tag. Right, that's what I'm asking about. Where's the $7 billion coming from? There's a lot of people who are willing to talk about how they're spending the money, but no one wants to talk about where it comes from. How many witnesses do we have here? We have the number? Mr. Chair?
10? Is it 10?
10 witnesses? 10 witnesses to tell us about how to spend money, but not a single one to tell us where the money comes from.
He tries in a variety of ways, but he doesn't get a response in the end. And eventually he hints at the answer, which the other side doesn't seem to want to admit, which is that they are printing money, which is another way of saying they are conjuring money out of thin air, money that doesn't exist, and then writing checks with it. Now, we all know that counterfeiting money, producing fake money and then paying for goods with it, is illegal for obvious reasons. Firstly, because it's fraudulent, it's dishonest, and secondly, because it can cause real harm to honest people by inserting money that doesn't actually exist into the economy. Printing money is the exact same thing, but it's when the government does it, and we all know that only the government is allowed to do corrupt things. Printing money means writing checks with money that doesn't exist to appease those who are on the receiving end of this fictitious money. And the immediate effect of this kind of policy is that it creates inflation. Now, I know this is exhausting if you're not familiar with this terminology, so just bear with me, stick with me. I'm going to start connecting some of these dots for you. Inflation, this concept that I just described, means that the money that exists in the economy is now worth less because it's been divided up by the addition of cash, fake cash, by the government. So the same amount of wealth exists in the economy, but now there are more dollar bills which represent that wealth, which means that each dollar bill is now worth less. So if you have a savings account with $5,000 in it, when inflation raises the cost of everything, that $5,000 isn't worth $5,000 anymore because it won't get you what $5,000 used to get you. This means that everything that the working class needs to provide for themselves costs more, making their vulnerability that much more severe. So things like food, fuel, housing, clothing, utilities, all of these things have now gone up in price, which, if you're among the working poor, is a huge injustice. Here in Canada, the average house price has gone up 21% just in the past year, and it went up significantly more the year before that when the pandemic started. This means that if you've been excluded from the housing market so far because of a lack of opportunity or because you started with nothing, you're renting, you're working hard, you're trying to save up to eventually purchase a property of your own, that prospect may have just been ripped away from you because of reckless government policies that favor those who already have wealth at the expense of those who don't. If I'm going to be totally candid about this, one way of looking at this is that the rich and the powerful, including government officials, threw the poor and vulnerable under the bus so that they could quarantine themselves from a threat, while the poor had to continue to find ways to sell their labor and take the risks that the rich didn't want to take, as they hid in their homes that they already owned. The next thing that I think is really important for us to observe and to be attentive to is that these policies weren't devised at the local level like subsidiarity implores us to do. They came from the largest international agencies we have, like the World Health Organization, or national agencies like the CDC or Health Canada. And they told local authorities what to do, and then they dutifully did so. They proposed these one-size-fits-all solutions for vast populations of people spread out over huge geographical areas, really, I mean, globally, if we're going to be honest about this, with no nuance and no appreciation for exemptions to these rules, exceptions to these rules, of which there were countless. This approach, if you haven't detected already, is a vulgar infringement on the principle of subsidiarity. And how did we as a church respond? Sadly, and much to my own lament, we were silent. We kept silent. We acquiesced our moral authority to the United Nations, pharmaceutical conglomerates, and agencies like the CDC. And lastly, what about that poke that was imposed through coercive measures, if not mandated? Everyone, regardless of age, risk factor, natural immunity, or general health, was told that they must cooperate in this collectivist policy. No appreciations or allowance for nuances and specifics like, what if I'm in an age group that has virtually zero risk of getting seriously sick? Oh, well, you need to do it to prevent you from passing it on to others. Again, this sort of collectivist mindset. Well, we now know that that didn't even work. It was utterly ineffective at producing that effect. But millions upon millions of young people were coerced into cooperating with a policy that was based on incomplete research, which we now realize turned out to be wrong. And because the lack of prudence in this could have been sniffed out from miles away with anybody who had a critical instinct or a mustard seed's worth of prudence, many people refused and were fired from their jobs and refused unemployment help while being outcast and villainized by the media, who received themselves untold billions from the payouts. Money that Mr. Polyev is still wondering if anybody knows what the source of it is. I made a video a few weeks back in which I admitted that I was struggling, and I don't think I was entirely candid about all the reasons why I was really struggling. And I think I can be a little more upfront about that now. I was really disturbed by what I was seeing going on, and I expected that in a time of crisis, in a time of struggle and confusion, those of us who are Catholic, we should be able to turn to the church for clarity and for refuge. But I feel like we as a church betrayed ourselves and those we keep professing to care about, the poor. What was really happening is that we were scared, and so we hid in our homes. And not everybody could do that. Of course, the most vulnerable and the most poor couldn't just do that. And cowardice is bad enough, but then to hide behind a facade of social justice while simultaneously throwing the poor into further destitution and then congratulating ourselves for doing our part for the common good, that's revolting. And I'm sorry for being so critical and so negative. And I hope that doesn't drive you to the point of despair. I think it might be helpful to know that this kind of thing isn't unprecedented in the church's history. When Henry VIII declared himself the supreme head of the church in England, the majority of bishops ratified the act, though it was clearly heretical and motivated by his lust for women and power. In fact, I think St. John Fisher was the only bishop, correct me if I'm wrong, who refused to go along with the program, and he lost his head for it. Now, fortitude is a cardinal virtue as defined by natural law and upheld by church teaching. And I think it's time we all refamiliarize ourselves with it, because it is seriously lacking in this age we live in. It means courageously doing what is right, even and especially when it's hard to do and it might cost you something. And it seems to me that this is obviously something that very few people were willing to do through this crisis. And it's why it was made far worse than it needed to be. And our Lord's words come to mind when I think about that. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate that leads to destruction. And as the modern world approaches its next great crisis, due to the frailty of the principles that it now relies upon, the fallacious principles, which is to say that we should expect there to be another crisis before long, consider being one of the few who will stand up for what is right and true, even if you end up in the minority as a result. Thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you feel called to support this work, then consider joining the Reinforcements, which is my online community. There are multiple tiers, including free access for those who can't help financially but still want to join. You can join up at www.brianholdsworth.ca. Certain levels will also get a free gift basket from Glory and Shine, who is a family-owned Catholic bath and body products company whose beard balm I'm wearing right now. It's like aromatherapy for your face. Even if you don't join, they make amazing products, so check them out at gloryandshine.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe. You don't have to agree with everything I said to get value out of these kinds of conversations, so be sure to subscribe to be edified or challenged. There's value in both.